Hi, I'm Tom Savini, and you're watching Cryptid Creatures with Augie Macro.
This is Augie Macro with Cryptid Creatures. This episode is the first in a two-part series following the origins, the evolution, the history, and the mystery behind one of the most infamous cult classic monsters of all, the living dead. Legends of undead monsters and walking corpses exist across the world, are told by virtually every culture throughout history, and are fundamental characters in the collective human mythos, like Bigfoot, werewolves, ghosts, and dragons. The initial intent with this episode was to simply discuss the history of zombies and their development through time, but in our research, we came across so many different stories that existed long before any notion of zombies did. Stories of blood-sucking ghouls, dead bodies possessed by demons, walking skeletons, revenants, living mummies, and much more. And that's not including the actual folkloric zombie of Haitian Vodou tradition. So we decided to give these pre-modern undead their own episode, to represent and honor their stories. Stories of the living dead are as old as time, with even the most ancient civilizations having myths about them. It is important to make a distinction, however, that we are not talking about ghosts or spirit beings, but rather reanimated corpses and creatures that derive from them. In many legends, the boundary between corporeal and incorporeal is very blurry or non-existent, with many early accounts describing spirits possessing dead bodies or corpses coming back to life because of faulty or incomplete burials. But purely spiritual beings are not what we're talking about in this episode, though we have discussed them in multiple past episodes, such as Season 1, Episode 7, A Brush with the Unknown, Season 2, Episode 6, The Haunted Temple of Johnstown, and in Season 2, Episode 9, The Haunted Castle of Loveland. Some of the earliest stories of undead creatures come from the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Nile. One of the first legends related to the undead is a creature called the Edimu, which is a Mesopotamian vengeful spirit said to rise from the grave for being improperly buried. They were said to possess people who do not respect certain cultural taboos, and were often blamed for disease and crime among the living, though they could be appeased with funeral repasts and libations, righting the wrongs of their improper burial. In more modern versions of the story, they are sometimes interpreted as literal undead or vampires, despite being spiritual in ancient traditions. Another early mention from ancient Mesopotamia comes from a Sumerian myth known as the Descent of Ishtar, where the goddess Ishtar, in an attempt to enter the underworld, threatens, "If you do not open the gate for me to come in, I shall smash the door and shatter the bolt. I shall smash the doorpost and overturn the doors. I shall raise up the dead, and they shall eat the living, and the dead shall outnumber the living." This threat is also repeated in early versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Perhaps the most famous ancient undead creature is the mummy. To explore this further, we visited Allegheny Cemetery in the neighborhood of Lawrenceville, outside of Pittsburgh in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, which we also visited in Season 2, Episode 12, The Cemetery Special. Here we are in Allegheny Cemetery, in the neighborhood of Lawrenceville, in Pittsburgh in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, at the mausoleum of American industrialist Emil Winter. However, it is not Emil Winter himself who brings us here today, but rather the Egyptian aesthetic that his mausoleum implements. We're here to discuss one of the most famous undead creatures of all, mummies, the desiccated corpses of pharaohs who have come back to life to bring plagues and curses to the mortal world. Though it is important to note, contrary to what one might think, these creatures have origins that are not rooted in ancient history, with the practice of mummification being a sacred rite of passage to the Egyptians, a necessary procedure for every soul to pass on to the hereafter and remain into eternity, not something to create fanciful tales about. In 1798, when French forces led by Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Egypt and brought archaeological plunder back to Europe, interest regarding ancient Egypt grew, giving rise to a period known as Egyptomania, which lasted into the early 1900s and was characterized by a romanticized view of ancient Egyptian life, culture, and arts. This influenced everything from fashion to architecture, creating an artistic and architectural movement called Egyptian Revival, which is still present in Masonic temples, hotels, movie theaters, casinos, justice buildings, museums, monuments, and funerary sites like this to this day. From the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas to the Washington Monument in DC to the Louvre Pyramid in Paris. Along with this Egyptian revival, a mummy mania also occurred, as interest in the darker sides of Egyptian culture grew among the wealthy. Extravagant mummy unwrapping parties were held by Victorian-era elites in Europe and America, where aristocrats and doctors would unwrap mummies from their bandages over cocktails, often keeping bones and linens from the corpses as souvenirs. Powders made from ground mummies were even sold and used as makeup foundations, consumable cure-all medicines, and as pigment to create a paint color dubbed mummy brown. In this period of Egyptomania, fantastic stories of mummies also became popular, including the first accounts of living mummies. Tales like the 1840 short story The Mummy's Foot by Théophile Gautier, the 1887 Gothic novel She, A History of Adventure by H. Rider Haggard, and the 1903 novel The Jewel of Seven Stars by Bram Stoker established the idea of a mummy reanimated from the dead to exact revenge on the living. Many living mummies of this time were represented in a romantic or sexual light, manifest as exotic and attractive women who would serve as seductive antagonists or even romantic love interests for the protagonist, metaphorically representing the sexualized Orientalism and colonial romanticism of the time. However, the mummy went from romantic to monstrous in the 1932 horror classic The Mummy, where Boris Karloff truly brings the creature to life and establishes it alongside Dracula and Frankenstein's monster in the pantheon of the classic Gothic monsters of the silver screen. The mummy has since taken many different forms, with the romantic mummy being revived in works such as Anne Rice's 1989 novel The Mummy, the classic 90s supernatural horror show Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and in the 2017 reboot of the Mummy franchise. But the monstrous version remaining dominant, from appearances in Scooby-Doo, Goosebumps, and Marvel Comics, to the Brendan Fraser Mummy trilogy, the Night of the Museum films, and the Hotel Transylvania movies. The mummy, though not truly an ancient creature in the folkloric sense, is one of modern culture's most infamous monsters, and will likely stand the test of time, as have the Sphinx and the pyramids, among the ever-shifting sands of the desert. Another famous undead creature from the ancient Middle East is the ghoul, a term which now just denotes any sort of monster or especially macabre person, but whose origin is much more specific. The concept of the ghoul comes from pre-Islamic Arabian polytheism, where it is described as a malevolent jinn which possesses a corpse, causing them to effectively rise from the grave in order to kill and feed on the living. They are said to dwell in cemeteries, abandoned buildings and ruins, the desert, and other uninhabited places, from which they can lure unsuspecting mortals to their doom. They are known to drink the blood of their victims, especially young children, as well as consume their flesh and steal any coinage they carry on their person, before taking the form of their latest victim to fill in for them until they kill again. They will eat other animals and scavenge upon the dead, but they seem to prefer human prey. They will eat other animals and scavenge upon the dead, but they seem to prefer live human prey. They are also said to be nocturnal and cave-dwelling, only coming out to hunt at night when the desert is cool and the light of the sun is not there to ward them off. These creatures often served as a cautionary tale to small children to not venture out at night, and their stories continue on to this day. Ghouls were one of the many types of jinn to be adopted into Islam when it became the dominant religion in Arabia, with stories of them appearing in hadith, or Islamic oral tradition, though not in the Quran itself. Many versions of the story at this time describe them as taking on female forms, called ghoulas, so that they can seduce male travelers to their doom. As the ghoul became known to Westerners, particularly the English, the creature became associated with grave robbing, and in the United States, authors such as Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft expanded on the idea, with Lovecraft describing them as a subterranean race with bestial features and human intelligence that reside in underground tunnel systems and occasionally come up to surface and feed on the human dead. He also compares them to changelings, who will kidnap human infants and replace them with supernatural doppelgangers, which has inspired ghoul renditions from authors such as Neil Gaiman and Guillermo del Toro. Are there really ghoulish undead monsters roaming the graveyards and uninhabited reaches of the Middle East in search of human prey? We may never know.
Dun dun dun!
The European continent is full of different stories of undead creatures as well. In Croatia and Serbia, there are stories of a creature called a Drekovac, described as an undead corpse created from the soul of a sinful man or an unbaptized child, which comes out at night during winter and early spring to spread sickness and death among the living. They are said to take the form of a particular child to prophesy their death, and turn into an animal to foretell disease among livestock. Though this is mostly a cautionary tale for children, there are still some today who believe they exist, with occasional sightings still being reported in Serbia. In the Czech Republic and Slovakia, there are stories of a creature called the Fext, an undead being with origins in the 30 Years' War, a major continent-wide conflict between the Catholic and Protestant powers of Europe between 1618 and 1648. The war began in the region of Bohemia in modern-day Czechia, and the fighting during the war was centered in what was then the Holy Roman Empire. It was this war and its horrors that inspired the legend of this creature, with accounts saying that the being was immortal and impervious to spear, arrow, musket, and cannon fire. Apparently the only way to kill it was with a bullet made of glass, and many of the great generals of the time were even called Fexts because of their assumed invincibility. The most famous Slavic undead creature is the vampire, which has origins in the folklore of ancient and medieval Romania and Greece. Though important to mention vampires, the concept of blood-sucking supernatural monsters is in itself its own phenomenon, and is more than deserving of its own episode. However, there is another similar creature that I will elaborate on, called the Vrkolikas. This being is sort of a sister story to that of the early vampire, developing around the same time but in Greece rather than Romania. The Vrkolikas is described as the reanimated corpse of a person who either lived a sacrilegious lifestyle, was excommunicated, or was buried in unconsecrated ground. They are described as having bloated, non-decomposed bodies with reddish skin and hair and gray eyes, covered in blood from a fresh kill. They are said to wander graveyards, cause poltergeist-like activity in homes, spread disease, and hunt humans at night, consuming their flesh, particularly livers, rather than drinking their blood. Perhaps one of the most ubiquitous images of undead creatures is that of the walking skeleton, which is found in fantasy, gothic fiction, horror, as well as mythology, folklore, and art across the world. Most often it is a human skeleton, but other species are not unheard of as serving the same death incarnate function. Most notably, animated human skeletons were used as a personification of death in Western culture since the Middle Ages, which is likely influenced by visuals described in the Bible. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel is described as having a vision involving a place referred to as the Valley of the Dry Bones, which is exactly as it sounds, a valley full of dry human bones. In his vision, the bones connect together into human figures, then seem to grow flesh, organs, tendons, and skin before God reveals them as the people of Israel in exile and commands Ezekiel to carry another prophecy in order to resurrect these people and bring them back to their homeland. In the book of Revelation, only one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse is named explicitly: Death. He is described as the Pale Rider, carrying a scythe in order to reap the souls of all those who will perish in the end times at the hands of the Antichrist. In medieval art, this character is usually depicted as a ghostly skeleton in a long dark cloak, being the inspiration for another similar character who also personifies death itself, the Grim Reaper. All of these visuals, concepts, and characters, however, converge in 1346, when the bubonic plague arrived in Europe and the Black Death began. It only makes sense that this event would be the source of so many of these classic visuals of death and decay, with just how much of a toll this plague took on the European population. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of all of Europe's population was dead as a result of the disease. That's about 10% of all of humanity at the time. And since ideas like germ theory wouldn't be conceived for another 4 centuries, many looked to the heavens for an answer and believed that God was angry with humanity, or that the end was nigh and Judgment Day had come. Among the many social, religious, political, and economic upheavals it brought, the Dark Ages also brought death more than ever into everyday life and thought. And to cope, many people personified their woes as a skeletal villain in a cloak with a scythe, or as a merry band of skeletons holding hands in a circle dancing the danse macabre, or as a dark, bony angel on a pale horse who followed with him hell itself to summon the end of the world. Even beyond the Dark Ages to the present day, we carry the scars of that treacherous era with us in the form of these characters and these stories. The skeletons still walk with us in the works of Walt Disney, Tim Burton, and Ray Harryhausen. The Grim Reaper still appears in everything from Bill and Ted's to Puss in Boots, and the idea of death is still very much present with us and won't be going anywhere anytime soon. In Norse mythology, there are stories of a malevolent revenant called a draugr, often portrayed in modern works as Norse supernatural zombies, based loosely on their depictions in the Icelandic sagas. In these, draugrs are described as being dangerous corporeal undead that protect their burial mounds and possess superhuman strength and magical abilities such as shapeshifting. They are said to be hideous, rotting corpses, necrotic black and blue in color, and reeking of death and decay. In some accounts, their bite is also able to spread their condition like a modern zombie or vampire. Draugrs are primarily motivated by envy and greed, and they have an innate jealousy of the living and a longing for the things of life they once had, as well as an insatiable appetite, particularly in the form of humans and livestock. They are said to only come out at night and be impervious to weapons, meaning only the strongest of Norse heroes were able to take them on. Once dispatched, the draugr was usually decapitated or burned to ashes to ensure that it is dead and gone. To prevent someone from reawakening as a draugr, people were often buried with open scissors on their chests straw in their clothes, or needles in their feet, and corpse doors were often used and then bricked up to prevent the spirit from returning to the house in which they lived and died. The most famous version of the Draugr is from Icelandic folklore, but there are some variations in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and on the Faroe Islands. In more recent legend, particularly in modern fantasy, there is an undead creature called a lich. Though the word itself was traditionally used to refer to any corpse, reanimated or otherwise, it was adopted into fantasy role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons to describe a powerful wizard who seeks immortality through necromancy and dark magic, surrendering their soul into a physical object called a soul artifact or phylactery. Like the story of Dorian Gray and his portrait which ages for him, the lich remains immortal as long as its soul remains intact in its artifact, often hidden somewhere remote and safe from danger. Even if the corporeal body is completely destroyed, their soul remains tied to the physical realm, unable to pass on to the afterlife, leaving the lich as a spirit that can resurrect itself through its own necromancy. The only way to destroy this being completely is by destroying its phylactery, severing its tie to the material world and thus allowing it to permanently die. Though the lich is most common in modern pop culture, from Lord Voldemort in Harry Potter, to Vecna in Dungeons & Dragons, to the Lich in Adventure Time, there is one being from medieval folklore that embodies the idea of the lich. He is called Koshchei the Deathless, and appears in Slavic mythology as a grotesque skeletal sorcerer wielding powerful dark magic, and being able to shapeshift and control the elements. His soul artifact is a needle, said to be inside an egg, inside a duck, inside a rabbit, inside an iron or crystal chest, buried under a green oak tree on a remote island. He is said to kidnap women in the form of a tornado and ride around the mountains of Russia on an enchanted horse. But it is his fear of death that drives him and proves to be his fatal flaw, as, according to the Russian fairy tale, the death of Koshchei the Deathless, he was defeated when his soul in the needle was destroyed by Prince Ivan Tsarevich and his wife Maria Morevna. After Koshchei's phylactery was destroyed, Ivan killed him with a club and burned his body. With that, Koshchei the Deathless was dead. Were there really powerful necromancers who once terrorized the medieval world, who locked their souls away in talismans hidden away from civilization, who defied death and nature to seek nothing short of immortality? We may never know. Though Europe and the Middle East have some of the most well-documented undead stories, the rest of the world is also chock full of living dead legends. In India, there are stories of a being called a Vetala, described as being an intelligent evil spirit that resides around charnel grounds, above-ground sites where human bodies are left to putrefy and decay uncovered. They are said to use reanimated corpses as vehicles to allow them to move about in the physical realm, and can possess or leave a dead body at will. They are said to be hostile spirits of the dead that are trapped in a sort of twilight zone between life and afterlife, causing them to claw desperately at the living world and possess corpses. They are said to voice their displeasures by troubling humans, driving people mad, killing children, and causing miscarriages. These creatures can be repelled by chanting mantras, and one can free them from their ghostly existence by performing funerary rites for them. Being unrestricted by the conventions of time and space, they are said to have uncanny knowledge of the past, present, and future, and deep insight into human nature, causing sorcerers, according to legend, to often try to bind them into servitude. In Japan, there are stories of a yokai called a gashadokuro, described as a giant skeleton spirit made of the skulls of those who died in battle or of starvation. They are said to be over 30 feet tall and have yellow or green bulging eyes, making a chattering noise with their teeth when they hunt. They are said to prowl around 2 a.m. in search of human prey. The creature first appears in myths dating back to the 10th century AD, particularly in a legend regarding a prominent samurai from the Kanto region named Taira no Masakado, who supposedly summoned one from the bones of those who died in battle alongside him and unleashed it on Kyoto. It has reappeared in books and articles since the 1960s, but remains a lesser-known yokai in Japanese mythology. Across the Pacific and North America, particularly among the Algonquin tribes of the Great Lakes in Canada, there are stories of a monstrous creature known as the Wendigo, which we discussed in Season 2, Episode 2, A Man-Eating Madness, and Season 3, Episode 2, Wendigo 2, Blood and Ice. Though we have discussed it in previous episodes, it is still important to note, as it represents one of the American versions of the undead monster concept, and shares many similarities with other undead creatures, such as spirit possession, an appetite for human flesh, supernatural abilities, and the ability to spread its state of undeath to others like a disease. In China, there are stories of a creature called the Jiangshi, which is essentially the Chinese equivalent of the vampire legend, but has characteristics and attributes that make it almost more ghoul than vampire. It is said to appear as a rotting corpse in a state of rigor mortis, giving it an awkward hopping gait, which is where its nickname, the hopping vampire, comes from. It is also said to have pale greenish skin due to the presence of a green mold on its body, which grows on it as a result of it being dead. Interestingly, in some modern interpretations, this fungus is compared to the cordyceps fungus, which infects insects, being speculated to be the source of the Jiangshi's condition. They are also said to have long hair and animalistic feral behaviors, attacking their prey with superhuman brute strength and clumsy violence. The creature is said to consume a person's chi, or life force, the fluid essence that gives living things life, rather than blood like with Western vampires. They are also said to be blind, finding their prey using their senses of smell and hearing. Despite being in a state of rigor mortis, they are said to be able to run very fast, or even fly through the air after their prey. There are also many ways to deter a Jiangshi, such as placing rice in front of your door, which supposedly induces the state of arithmomania, where they must count every single grain of rice before moving on to another task, which is an unusually common behavior with vampires across cultures. They are also said to be afraid of mirrors, fire, handbells, a rooster's call, and items made from the wood of a peach tree, among other things. And to immobilize them, one can stick to its forehead a specific type of Taoist talisman called a fulu, which is a piece of yellow fabric with incantations written on it. Though the Jiangshi is a story millennia old, it has had a recent impact on pop culture in East Asia, with an entire genre of horror cinema and literature focused on the Jiangshi, appearing in the 1980s in Hong Kong and spreading across the region. The Jiangshi now appears in movies, TV shows, books, as toys, and in video games across Asia, as well as being popular for Halloween costumes, and as one of China's most famous legendary monsters. Is there really a fearsome undead being residing in the wilderness of China, mindlessly pursuing the very life force of its prey? We may never know. Now to the subject of zombies. Zombies stand as by far the most infamous of all undead creatures, aside from maybe vampires. The visual of the horde of walking, rotting corpses in abandoned cityscapes, wandering hungrily in search of living brain and flesh, and spreading their necrotic virus to everyone else, is one that is intrinsic to how we view the zombie today. But their origins are far more fascinating and far darker than one might think. The story begins in West and Central Africa, where various tribes practiced rich belief systems and told stories of spirits and deities that governed the world around them. To the Ambundu people of Angola, they were known as Nzumbi, and to the Congo people of Central Africa, they were called Nzambi or Zumbi. In their mythology, the creator deity was known as Nzambi Ampungu, or the Sky Father. In both of these languages, the term means either god or spirit or fetish, as in an object or idol representing said deity. Among these African cultures, there was also a strong belief in the soul, and that a sorcerer could potentially steal the soul of an individual and use it for their own purposes. However, in the 16th century, European imperial powers such as Portugal and Spain began interacting with African imperial powers such as the kingdoms of Dahomey and Congo, and began trading European goods such as firearms, textiles, alcohol, and horses for gold, spices, and human beings in the form of enslaved Africans. As the overseas empires of Europe grew in the New World and the plantation system became dominant in places like the Caribbean, and in what is now the American South, to produce cash crops like sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, interest in cheap sources of free labor that would be used to harsh conditions and subtropical climates grew as well. The first transport of African slaves to the Americas occurred in 1526, and thus the Atlantic slave trade was born. This practice lasted until around 1873, and over the course of those 400 years, an estimated 12 to 13 million Africans were shipped to the Americas. Between 1.2 and 2.4 million died as a result of the voyages themselves, and millions more died from a combination of slave raids, wars, and the conditions in the seasoning camps designed to acclimate slaves to their new home. In spite of all of this, enslaved Africans still preserved their culture, their stories, and their oral tradition. As time went on and new generations were born in the New World, these traditional African belief systems and stories were blended together with the beliefs of Native American populations, as well as those of the European colonists, primarily Catholicism. As a result, new forms of spiritual expression developed across the Americas, from candomblé in Brazil to Santeria in Cuba, to the beliefs of the Gullah Geechee in the coastal islands of the Carolinas and Georgia. However, the most well-known of these is probably Vodou, which is the one that we are concerned with here. Vodou is a branch of a larger religious belief called Vodun, which is a traditional African religion practiced by the Aja, Ewe, and Fon peoples of Benin, Togo, Ghana, and Nigeria. Vodun teaches the existence of a supreme creator deity, as well as lesser deities or spirits called Vodun, who play subordinate roles in the governance of the natural world. The specific deities venerated depend on the area in which it is being practiced, and deities are often absorbed from other religions, such as Christianity, Hinduism, and Yoruba religion. During the Atlantic slave trade, practitioners and believers of Vodun, called Vodun Sento, were among the enslaved Africans brought to the New World, bringing Vodun with them. When Vodun arrived on the island of Hispaniola, to what is now Haiti, it began to mix with Catholicism, and characters such as the Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints were adopted into the African belief structure. Thus, Vodun became a new religion known as Vodou. Vodou has the same overall cosmology as Vodun, featuring a transcendent creator deity called Bondier, under whom exist spirits that control specific aspects of reality, now called Loa. These Loa usually derive their identities from West and Central African deities, but unlike in Vodun, they are equated to Catholic saints, with Vodou practitioners believing in both the divinity of Christ and the existence of these Loa. Divination, giving offerings to spirits, and honoring the dead are all common practices that remain from Vodun. Remember how I mentioned African tribal stories of spirits and deities earlier? Well, this is where they come back into the story. In Haitian Vodou, there is a type of priest called a Bokor, which is said to serve Loa and practice magic for both good and evil. Because of this, Vodouists often treat them as sorcerers or witches. Their most infamous practice in Haitian folklore is the ability to use their magic to perform acts of necromancy and raise the dead from the grave, reviving their bodies but keeping their souls. In Vodou, the soul is seen as a sort of dual being, one component being the physical body, and the other being the spirit. Bokors, by resurrecting the dead, sever the spirit from the flesh and keep the spirit for themselves, giving them total control of the body and turning the corpse into the Bokor's own personal slave, with no will of its own. This is what it is to be a zombie. By capturing the zombie's spirit, the Bokor also becomes more powerful, allowing them to enhance their supernatural abilities and make more zombies. Though this story had been told for centuries in Haiti, the Haitian zombie first gained international attention between 1915 and 1934, during the United States occupation of Haiti, when U.S. military forces invaded and occupied the country and ruled through martial law, following years of political and socioeconomic turmoil. During this time, a number of case histories began to emerge describing purported zombies. In 1929, American explorer William Seabrook published his non-fiction travelogue, The Magic Island, which chronicled his experiences regarding Haitian Vodou during his time in Haiti. In the book, he includes an account of zombies he observed working on a plantation of the Haitian American Sugar Company, as well as citing Article 246 of the Haitian Criminal Code related to poisoning, which he believed referred to the creation of zombies via poisonous drugs. In 1937, while studying folklore in Haiti, American writer, anthropologist, and documentary filmmaker Zora Neale Hurston encountered a case of a woman called Felicia Felix Mentor, who had supposedly risen from the grave and returned to her home village after 30 years. Hurston came to a similar conclusion as Seabrook, that zombies are not produced by ceremony or necromancy, but by the administering of a powerful psychoactive drug. This chemical explanation for the zombie was further explored in 1982 by anthropologist and ethnobotanist Wade Davis when he traveled to Haiti to investigate. Following his time there, he claimed that a living person can indeed be turned into a zombie by the introduction of two special powders into the person's bloodstream. The first powder, known as coupe de poudre, contains tetrodotoxin, a powerful and usually fatal neurotoxin harvested from the flesh of pufferfish. The second powder consists of deliriant drugs such as datura, a highly poisonous plant in the nightshade family, commonly known as thornapple or Jimson weed. Together, these powders supposedly have an effect similar to Lazarus syndrome, placing the victim in a state of suspended animation before a reawakening. Often by this time, though, the victim has been buried, giving the impression that they are rising from the dead. After reanimation, they are left in a state of severe psychosis, and in this impressionable and low emotion condition, they convince themselves they are zombies, reinforced by cultural traditions of zombies. When they are eventually recollected by their Bokor from the graveyard, their will is entirely subject to that of their new master. Davis also popularized the story of Clervius Narcisse, a Haitian man who claimed to have been turned into a zombie with these powders by a Vodou practitioner and forced to work as a slave for many years. Davis presented his pharmacological hypothesis in a 1983 article in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology, as well as in his 1985 book, The Serpent and the Rainbow. This concept has been the inspiration for multiple pieces of media since, such as in the NBC supernatural drama Grimm, where zombies are portrayed as being created by a pufferfish-like creature, which spits a mucus containing tetrodotoxin into the victim's face, causing paralysis, a Lazarus syndrome-like reanimation, and a prolonged period of extreme aggression and suggestibility toward their creator. However, Davis's claims have been contested over the years, particularly the notion that a Bokor can keep their zombies in this drug-induced trance for many years on end. Symptoms of tetrodotoxin poisoning vary from numbness and nausea in small doses to, in large doses, complete paralysis, including of the diaphragm, causing asphyxiation, unconsciousness, and death in a matter of minutes. This does not include a stiff rigor mortis-like gait, a death-like trance, Lazarus syndrome, or increased suggestibility, no matter the dosage. Others have also discredited Davis's assessments of the nature of zombie accounts as overly credulous, or taking too literally what is simply legend and folklore. There are also psychological and social explanations for the story, such as the zombification being an explanation for certain forms of schizophrenia and other mental illnesses, particularly ones that manifest as a state of catatonia, where the individual may appear dead before reawakening in a delirious and psychotic state. Others claim that the zombie phenomenon is a culture-bound syndrome, related to particular cultural forms of adoption practiced in Haiti, where the homeless or mentally ill are reunited with grieving families who see them as returned lost loved ones, as if they were being brought back from the proverbial grave. When evaluating the original legends of zombies, it is apparent that whether there is a real-life scientific explanation or not, the legend has a deeper purpose, as a metaphor for slavery. Some person with more power and authority than you has taken your existence and modified it to serve theirs, leaving you with no free will of your own, no autonomy, no personhood. All that is left is a husk, a shell of what was once a person, but now exists to serve, to be commanded, to slave away without a second thought or backhanded remark. At least in real life, a slave can think for themselves, speak if they choose, rise up against their master if they desire, even if it will result in severe punishment. But a zombie has neither the voice nor the mind of their own to do any of those things. And they will remain that way indefinitely until either their necromantic master releases them, God saves their soul, or forever. The Vodou religion spread outside of Haiti as well. During the Haitian Revolution between 1791 and 1804, refugees from Haiti escaped to Louisiana, which was recently bought by the United States from revolutionary France in 1803. In Louisiana, these refugees interacted with the enslaved Africans already there, who had their own African Catholic indigenous hybrid spiritual practices. The mixing of these with Vodou created a new spiritual system, Voodoo. In the early 1900s, Louisiana Voodoo began to die out, being replaced with a looser spiritual tradition seen across the American South called Hoodoo. But all of these versions of Vodou still retain the zombie legend because of how strongly it resonated with those African diaspora who had to live through the days of slavery, who had to toil and suffer their entire lives in the name of people who did not care about them, who had to be born, live, and die as property. We think of zombies now as walking corpses that eat brains, but they are so much more than that. They represent what it means to have liberty taken away, to lose all humanity, individuality, spirit, and self, until all that's left is bones. To see the conclusion of this two-part investigation of the living dead, tune in next time for Season 3, Episode 4. Same bat time, same bat channel. Thanks for watching, and to watch our previous and future episodes, visit the Cryptid Creatures YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, and tell your friends. Cryptid Creatures is brought to you by the Kitty Petters Union, Cobble Sound Recording Company, and my dad's show, Meet the Pressers. This is Cryptid Creatures with Augie Macro, signing off.